Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us for another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. My name is Kathleen Newman. It is April 1st, 2021, and this is Mortality and Memorialization in Portland at the time of statehood with Ron Romano. A native of Portland, Maine, Ron Romano currently serves on two nonprofit volunteer boards. He's been with the Friends of Portland's Eastern Cemetery organization, or Spirits Alive, for many years. And he serves as an officer on the National Association for Gravestone Studies Board. He is a frequent lecturer on early gravestones and Maine's gravestone markers. He is the author of Portland's Eastern Cemetery, Early Gravestones in Southern Maine, and Billboard Monuments of Maine, as well as numerous articles. Thank you so much, Ron, for being with us this evening and sharing your expertise with our audience.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Are you ready for me to share screen?
Yes, we are.
Thank you. So I want to start by saying, of course, thank you to Maine Historical Society for hosting the talk tonight. This is a project that I've been working on for about a year now, and expected that we were going to be able to all get together throughout the actual statehood celebration. But of course, a little virus had other plans for us all. So as we sort of wind down our celebration of Maine statehood many years later, I thought what better way to sort of take a look at what was going on than by looking at the end of lives that lived at that time and how people of Portland managed the deaths and memorialization of people that were living in our town. So with that, I'm going to go through a lot of slides tonight. We'll go relatively quickly. We'll have time at the end for discussion and questions and answers. And let's just get started. So the first thing for context, I think it's important for people to understand that Portland's reach in 1820 was far less extensive than it is certainly today. Basically, Portland, the town of Portland, was what you see here in this map from 1823, so just 3 years after statehood. It was really what we call Portland Neck, or the peninsula of Portland, about 3 miles wide and half a mile to a mile deep. And you can see fairly undeveloped still in some sections of the city. This, of course, Back Cove got filled in. Down on the waterfront here also got filled in over many years. Westbrook was outside of Portland on the landward side, and what's now South Portland was then called Cape Elizabeth. So 1820 begins, and in January 4th of 1820, the Portland Gazette newspaper issued a report that discussed what the bill of, what they call it, a bill of mortality, what the mortality level had been over the past 7 years. On average, there were 120 deaths per year reported over those past 7 years. I pull a couple of quotes out of that article to share with you as we start. One of them is, the proportion of deaths to population is remarkably low in this town. So they were feeling very good about the fact that there were not that many deaths compared to other areas. And then an unusual degree of good health has been enjoyed. So 1 year later, in January of 1821, the Bill of Mortality was again released in the paper and shows us that, in fact, the year was a pretty good one. This line here in 1820, 71 adults and 59 children for a total of 130 people had passed during the calendar year 1820, which was better than the prior year of 146. Interestingly, they separated out the number of deaths that occurred at the almshouse. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that was 5 adults and 1 child. So the total was 136 in town. On average, that's 1 death every 3 days. Here's a snippet from the 4th US Census that was taken in 1820 that shows us the population of Portland at the time. So this is just more context as we begin. Total white persons in town, 8,357. People of color, 224. So the grand total was 8,581. The death rate then was 16 per 1,000. And today it's about half of that, according to the Maine Department of Public Health. Now that figure for today does not take into effect COVID. But I think that Maine has had such a favorable situation with COVID and far fewer deaths than many other areas. It might not really be that different today. So let's take another look here. Proportion of deaths to population. If you look in the bold on the left-hand side, Portland had, and I put in quotes, only 1 in 63 people dying at this time, compared to countries of Scotland, Norway, France, et cetera, and even the city of London. They were doing far worse. In London, 1 out of every 21 people were dying in this period. Again, Portland, 1 in 63. On the right is a snippet from one of the newspapers. This was also carried in Portland. We don't need to go through it all, but it's just for context that it's interesting. They compared the Portland proportion of death rate to other countries as opposed to other cities in the United States, although there were other cities reporting their deaths. The only place they could find that had a better proportion of deaths to population was in Russia, 1 in 79. So we were doing really quite well in 1820 with respect to the number of people dying per population. So we know that 136 people had died in Portland in 1820, and what I really wanted to do was meet them. I wanted to know who these people were and learn about them. So my plan of attack was a multiple routes here, but primarily I started with looking at the burial records for Eastern Cemetery, which was the burying ground for the city. Also, I looked at every newspaper published in 1820 to look at the death notices and other articles. So the Eastern Argus and the Portland Gazette were the 2 weekly newspapers that were published in 1820. The Eastern Argus, you'll note here, was printed by Francis Douglas. That's a name that you want to remember. We'll come back to him in a little bit. Let's take a look at cemeteries in Portland today. Of course, this is the original town of Portland in 1820. Today, of course, Portland extends farther out. In yellow are the known burial grounds in Portland in 1820. So Eastern Cemetery is right here. That was the town's burying ground. On the Eastern Promenade was a small mass grave for some War of 1812 soldiers. This circle down here on the west end, which is now Western Cemetery, was not yet Western Cemetery in 1820. It was the Vaughan family burying ground. We'll talk about that more in detail as well. And this white circle is the almshouse. Now, I'll go to that in just a minute. It's not yellow because in 1820, it's unclear if there were burials there. Burials were clearly done at the almshouse in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, but it's not really clear if it was earlier than that. So I left it in white as opposed to yellow. These other red dots here are other known cemeteries in Portland today. The large one is Evergreen. Pine Grove is part of that. This, although is down here in South Portland, is actually Forest City Cemetery, which was purchased by the city for the overflow need of burial space once Eastern Cemetery had really filled up, and Western Cemetery as well. So Forest City is located in South Portland, but it's actually a Portland burying ground. There are burying grounds, as you can see, on Peaks Island. There's a small patch on House Island. And then the blue here is, I just threw it in for discussion. It's actually a pet cemetery on Mackworth Island. So we don't think there are any people there, but it is a cemetery nevertheless. So the almshouse, here's that map on the left that I showed you a minute ago, showing you the extent of Portland. In this circle here, we blow it up over to this side. There's the almshouse, as you can see. Westbrook is the bordering town. So the almshouse actually did open in 1804, temporary home for paupers, homeless, widows. And, you know, there may have been some burials in their property in 1820. And I suggest that that might be true because the bill of mortality separated out the deaths at the almshouse compared to the rest of the town. I'm not sure why else they might have done that. Again, we know for sure that burials occurred on the almshouse property mid-century. But when that property was redeveloped, all of those bodies were removed to a mass grave across to Forest City in South Portland. This site is where Hadlock Field is now. So that's the baseball field and the surrounding area. So now we take a look at the other cemeteries in today's Portland, which had burials that occurred in 1820. Certainly Eastern Cemetery would have had that. Western, this was again called the Vaughan Burying Ground. There was one burial in 1820. The rest of these, two at Sawyer Knight out in North Deering, Phobes, also North Deering, had 3, Bailey, 1, Pine Grove, part of Evergreen now had 6, and then Stroudwater Cemetery had 4. So there were 1820s burials outside the city, outside the town, but they wouldn't have been included in the Bill of Mortality records because they were Westbrook. So I was casting a really wide net here to figure out who these people were, 136 that we know died in Portland. Looking at the newspapers and the published burial records, also the record of interments. I went to Maine Historical and checked microfilm. Of course, I spent time on Ancestry, Find a Grave, and other websites. Spirits Alive has transcription records from when we've done conservation, and all of those were checked. The Bill of Mortality itself, I took literally when it said deaths for the town of Portland, so that those people who had ties to Portland but who had died elsewhere were excluded. And at the end of all of this, I could identify 118 people from the initial report of 136 deaths. So pretty close, 87% of the total I could find. So we're going to break it down a little bit. Now that we know who these people were, break it down by age, gender, etc. So the age distribution for the deaths in Portland in 1820 shows you that children made up 43% of the total, which is something you might expect, knowing that children had, many illnesses that took them down early, and in those days, without antibiotics and other good understanding of medicine, children just didn't make it often. So what is interesting is that of the people I was able to identify from infancy through age 19, which is what I selected as a definition of children, it's 43% of the total. And if you can see that, the Bill of Mortality did not use any age band, so I don't know where they cut off the adult and the children, but their breakdown is 44% children. So it's pretty close to what I found by calling children up to age 19. We did have one person who died in her 90s in 1820. So in most cases, gender, I was able to identify. The exceptions were for infant children. This is just a snippet from one of the newspapers that shows you the challenge there is that oftentimes in the newspaper, all they said was a child of Mr. Chase, a child of Mr. Hamilton, a child of Captain Reuben. So we got neither ages nor gender or even a name. And then I would have to go back and try and discover who these kids were by other means. This is an example of how I did that. From the Portland Gazette, the top snippet is from March before the census was taken in 1820. And you know that they had a child of Mr. Enos Merrill who died at age 13 months, again, before the census. The bottom one is in September, after the census was taken, a child of Mr. Joseph Crockett, age 10 months. Because that was after the census, it means this child was recorded in the census. And as luck would have it, here is the 1820 census record for Joseph Crockett. And interestingly, this is Mr. Crockett and his wife. And then the only children they had happened to be 3 males under age 10. So at least I was able to discover that this child in the paper was a male. This one up above, who had died before, I never could find any records to tell me who that was. So couldn't determine gender in that case. So of the 118 confirmed people, 110 of them I was able to put into male and female category. So let's look at race distribution. The Bill of Mortality didn't capture race in 1820, but 3 of the 118 were identified as Black in other sources. And that's pretty close to the expected number from the census, because remember that was 16 people per 1,000. There were about 250 people of color in Portland, so you would expect them to have been there for 4. I found 3. And from the newspaper, we find a couple of them at the same place. That's the almshouse. John Flood, a man of color, age 27, and then William Lloyd, a man of color, age 22, drowned in town. But interestingly, that same drowning was reported in another newspaper in Maine, but no race was reported. So you have to be careful because not all of them reported race, even when they reported deaths in the newspaper. The first directory for Portland wasn't published until after statehood, so that was in 1823. It was silent on race. It wasn't until the fourth edition in 1834 was published that race was captured. And in fact, what they did in that directory was listed everybody in town. And then at the end, page 120, as you can see, they had listings for people of color by ward. I was able to discover the third person of color who had died in 1820 because her name was Hagar Boaz or Bose, and it was her husband James, who is listed here in 1834 as a person of color, the surviving spouse of Mrs. Boaz. Okay, we'll move to monthly, deaths by months. What I was looking for here was there a pandemic? Was there some kind of outbreak of illness that took a lot of people down? And in fact, the deaths were low enough that there wasn't really any big trend here. The average number of deaths per month would be 10. And you can see that there's a dip in the spring, April, May, and June. It went down to 7 or 8, and then a little bit higher here, August, and then September peaked at 15 deaths that month. But for the most part, there wasn't anything that was, standing out as any particular illness that took a bunch of people down at one time. Statehood, of course, occurs in March of 1820. So technically, the people who had died in January, February, and first part of March were under Massachusetts, whereas once we became a state mid-March, these folks are true Mainers. And then causes of death in the Northeast. So in 1820, there were few vital records that were produced. All of the ones that were produced were silent on cause of death. Newspapers often just had a single line of the notice, unless it was for a newsworthy cause or a noteworthy individual. But elsewhere in the Northeast, bacterial illnesses really predominated, and that was primarily from contaminated water and food. This article that was printed in the Argus in September is hard to read, so I broke it down for you. In New York and Philadelphia, the main causes of death were, as you can see, primarily these bacterial illnesses. And there's no reason to believe that the same wasn't true in Portland. Sometimes people's cause of death was actually carved onto their gravestones. Now, these two are not 1820s markers, but I give them to you just to show you that, in fact, sometimes we learn about a cause of death by reading someone's gravestone. In this case, a woman who drowned and then a man who died of smallpox. One of the very earliest reports was, as you can see, January 11th in the newspaper, was really one of the saddest. And it was a story that was covered in 7 states, so it really got a lot of press. This was called a distressing accident. On Wednesday evening, Lucy Ann, age 7, daughter of Mrs. Monroe of this town, was burnt in the most shocking manner and expired the following morning about 1 o'clock. The melancholy circumstances, as we learned, are that in the absence of her mother, this child with her sister were in a room together about 8 o'clock. The gown of the deceased was discovered on fire, and her sister, by the aid of a fire rug, attempted to extinguish it. But not succeeding, the little sufferer in claims ran to the house of Captain J. Lewis, about 10 rods distant, forced herself into the kitchen, and from there into the parlor before any relief could be given. And here she presented herself in full flame to her relatives and all the horrors of swift destruction. She was immediately encircled with a rug by the hands of her friends, thrown down, and the fire extinguished, but alas, it was too late. Every vestige of clothing was consumed, even to her booties, which were a crisp. The frequent accidents of this kind should serve as a strong caution against clothing children in cotton or linen during the winter. So the publisher of the newspaper wanted to, make a point about this to other parents to take care. Other causes of death, there were 3 drownings in 1822 within a day. The first on Wednesday in July, son of Mr. Abraham Osgood, age 9, was playing on the stringers of Deering's Bridge, fell into the river, and before he could be extricated was drowned past recovery. The following day, Mr. Richard Bartlett, age 35, who had arrived in town just 2 days before from St. John, New Brunswick, hoping to establish himself in the tailoring business here. He went out with another man and a boy in a float to go fishing. He was drowned, and the other two held on to the float and were saved. He left behind a wife and 3 children at St. John. And then an accidental death of a very respected man. Remember at the beginning, I showed you the Eastern Argus with Francis Douglas, the printer and publisher. He actually lost his life to an accident, and it was carried in newspapers across 15 of the 23 states. So probably because he was a newsman, everybody elsewhere knew him. I'll quickly read that one as well. In this town, on Sabbath morning, Mr. Francis Douglas, proprietor of the Eastern Argus, was aged 37. He, on Saturday afternoon, in the company with another gentleman, went in a boat to the islands with a view of killing game. While there, he seized the fowling piece by the muzzle for the purpose of drawing it towards him, when it went off and discharged its contents into his knee and fractured the bones very much on each side. He was immediately brought back to town, but such was the loss of blood that he survived only till 2 o'clock. In the death of Mr. Douglas, this town has lost an active and useful citizen, and the establishment over which he presided, an industrious and ambitious proprietor. His remains were yesterday interred, and he was accompanied to the grave by the Portland Lodge and the Maine Charitable Mechanic Association, both of which he was a member. So he left behind his wife, but they had no children. Here's his eroding marble marker at Eastern Cemetery. You can just make out his name here, Francis Douglas, and it says proprietor and publisher of the Eastern Argus, and then the date and age. The following day, or the day after, the survivors of that newspaper wrote, on Saturday morning, the sun rose on but a few men with fairer prospects of a happy, prosperous, and lengthened life, and in a few hours, the whole area was overcast with the shadows of death. So there were some out-of-towners with links to Portland. I'll quickly go through those. There were 23 records found for people with ties to Portland, but died away from home. 3 in Maine, but just outside of Portland. And for some of those, a cenotaph was placed at the burying ground. So a cenotaph, for those of you who don't know, is a memorial placed on basically an empty grave. The person is buried elsewhere, but the family chooses to memorialize them at their local cemetery with a marker. So that's called a cenotaph. So we have in Lisbon, Maine, Mr. Bryant, age 64, came into the house in his usual health, seated himself in a chair, and expired instantaneously without a struggle or groan. Out of state, there were 4 people found. Josiah Corey was a sailor aboard the schooner Comet. This is a detail from his mother's gravestone at Eastern Cemetery, where her name and her husband's name are listed. It then says their son, Josiah, died at Norfolk, Virginia, September 20th, 1820. So he likely would have been buried at sea or buried there and not brought back. So this is, in fact, would be a cenotaph for him. Out of country, Cuba was the hotspot. 6 of the 9 international deaths were reported in Cuba, but they were also in St. Thomas, Bermuda, and this one here on the right from New Brunswick. This stone is at Eastern Cemetery for Mrs. Rebecca Mitchell, who died November 13th, 1820 at age 70. This could be a cenotaph, although maybe her remains were brought back for burial. Up above is the newspaper article in September, which talks about 3 of the deaths in Havana. These 3 men were taken sick on Thursday the 3rd, died Sunday within 3 hours of each other. So rapid was the progress of the disorder that medicine had no effect whatever. So that was William Wilson, George Elwell, and Robert Stetson, all of Portland. So lost at sea, there were 7. This is not a surprise because Portland especially had such a maritime-based economy. The marker on the right, the monument, is the tallest and largest we have at Eastern Cemetery for Rear Admiral James Alden. In the shadow of this monument is his nephew, Franklin Alden, who's named with a couple of others on this eroding marble, but he was one who was lost at sea and memorialized on this marker by his family. Again, being lost at sea, clearly this would be a cenotaph. And before we move on to the next section, just of note, I mentioned we had a 90-year-old person that was Mrs. Hannah Gooding, who was actually 96 when she died. Then we have Sally Tucker, widow of Mr. Josiah Tucker. She was 58, but she had outlived her husband and 10 children. And then finally in Portland, Colonel John Waite, who had served as High Sheriff of Cumberland County at age 87. So a couple of these folks lived to a good old age. Okay, we're going to move on to some burial practices now. Certainly in Portland, where there was a designated burying ground, backyard burials were not occurring. However, just off the peninsula, that clearly would have been what was going on. That was the practice in rural areas for people to just set up a small patch on their own property in which to bury their family members. Here's an example of a nicely kept one. This is actually on Chebeague Island. The Vaughan family burying ground became Western Cemetery around 1830. The Vaughan family owned much of that property, Bramhall Hill, in the west end of town. They had a lot set aside for their family burying ground, 100 feet by 100 feet, and at least 10 people were buried there before the whole area got taken over as Western Cemetery. 4 people in the family were buried prior to 1820. There was one burial in 1820, 5 afterwards after 1820. We'll meet the one in 1820 in a few minutes. But this was the burying ground for Portland. So Eastern Cemetery was not called Eastern Cemetery when it was established in 1668, so 150 years prior to statehood. It was called the burying ground. You can see that it's listed here. At the time, so this is Congress Street running this way, the waterfront, of course, down here. At the time, this was the designated burying ground. The town was basically situated here to the left. The entrance into the burying ground would have been, in this corner. This was a swamp, as you can see, just on the south side. This property was owned by Portland's first minister, who's shown here, Reverend Thomas Smith. He lived diagonally across the street, but he allowed people to go from back street into the burying ground by use of a pathway, which is now called Funeral Lane. This is where, as you go by Congress Street and look at the front gate, you're looking at this lane which goes into the rest of the burying ground. This became cemetery burying ground in 1795 when he died. So up until then, this was the only patch. By 1820, this was all cemetery. This burying ground was not a churchyard, so there was no church associated with it. It was a utilitarian burying space for the people, the citizens of Portland. And again, it wasn't called Eastern Cemetery until after Western Cemetery was established. And even then, they were referred to as the East Yard and the West Yard. And then over time, the word cemetery came into play. So Eastern Cemetery and Western Cemetery is what we call them today. Here's a blow up from the 1823 map. This is showing now in 1823 the full space. So this top half would have been the Reverend's land. This was the original burying ground. Here's where the swamp was, but you can see that Hancock Street actually was built up. The swamp was drained, Hancock Street was extended, and there was actually a Hancock Street gate into the cemetery right here. We have records for burials that say Mrs. Smith was buried by the Hancock Street gate. These two markers here are showing you that there were schoolhouses on this property. So Hancock Street gate, this is what you find today. If you walk up Hancock Street to Federal, this is where the gate would have been. Obviously, it's now a 12-foot retaining wall that was constructed after Portland's Great Fire in 1866. Federal Street was extended. Part of this burial hill was sort of carved away, and then the retaining wall was put up. So no more access via a Hancock Street gate as of 1866. That's when the Congress Street gate became the primary way in and out of the cemetery. So let's look at a more current map. This is the one Spirits Alive uses, and we're sort of flipping this upside down. Now Congress Street is here instead of on the top of the page. Here's the Congress Street gate, here's Funeral Lane, and then this is the newer section, which is private land until 1795, and this is the cemetery in its original, the oldest section here. So Hancock Street is here, Hancock Street gate is that disc right there. What you'll notice is when this was the burial ground for the first 150 years, and this was the way in down here, the minority people were put in the far reaches of the cemetery. So African Americans, Catholics, and Quakers were all sort of relegated to the far outreaches of the burying ground. The white Protestant majority were all in this area here. So the 118 people, we're back to them for a minute. The 118 confirmed Portland deaths, majority of them have proven burial at Eastern Cemetery. Either a plot record is known or a gravestone is found for them. But we need to keep in mind that vandalism has been very heavy at Eastern Cemetery, so there are many markers that have been stolen, broken, and lost. There's also natural loss that occurs, especially with marble markers. The slates last pretty well, but marble deteriorates more quickly. And we also have disinterments and reinterments into other cemeteries, which happened at the end of the 1800s. And I know of at least 2 people who died in 1820 who were originally buried at Eastern, but ended up over at Evergreen Cemetery instead. So it makes it a little complicated in finding where these people were. So we have proven burials and we have presumed burials. And what I did with presumed burials, I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is for a family well represented in Portland, 1820. And Captain Joseph McClellan gives us our example. His images, as you see on the left. He died, this is in Portland, in this town of Portland on Tuesday. Captain Joseph McClellan, age 88. He was a native of this town, and at the time of his decease was the oldest male inhabitant then living who was born in this place. Now, his wife had predeceased him by 7 years and was buried at Eastern Cemetery, and more than 60 members of his family were laid to rest at Eastern Cemetery before and after his death. So even though nobody has a burial record saying where he ended up, I put him as a presumed burial at Eastern Cemetery for that well-represented family that he was part of. And then here's the other example of spouses. So Neil Shaw, his name is just here on this slate marker, wife of Neil Shaw. Neil Shaw died February 24th in this town of Portland. His wife, Hepzibeth, had predeceased him in 1812. Her name is on that stone, but notice that there are empty plots on at least 2 on either side of her. The suggestion is that when he died 8 years later in 1820, he would have been buried beside her, and either the stone has been vandalized or lost or just wasn't placed. So let's move into burial practices now. So funerals, they were organized and held relatively quickly out of necessity. Of course, there was no widespread use of any kind of embalming, so bodies would deteriorate relatively quickly and had to be put in the ground soon after death. Funerals, if there were any, would have occurred at a family home. Word of this would have been spread by mouth. The weekly publishing schedule of the newspapers would have prevented any kind of timely notice. Here's one that did make the newspaper in January 18th, and this is Elizabeth Jordan Vaughan, who was the one person buried in the Vaughan burial ground, later Western Cemetery in 1820. She was 45. So you can see that they put a newspaper notice that her funeral would be at her brother's house that same day at 3 o'clock, and they invited relations and friends to attend the funeral without a more particular invitation. So only 7 newspaper accounts of funerals I found, was able to find, and you can see that burials occurred relatively quickly after their death, just a day after death, 2 days, and 3 days after death. So the burials were, the coffins that were used for burial take this form. This is actually a newspaper from 1813, but this shows you the shape of the box that people were put in. This is a gravestone from early 1800s with a carving of a coffin on it as well. So it's a 6-sided box. The body would have fit relatively tightly into that space. So it's not like what we see today with large oblong boxes. It just wasn't the case. These were simple wooden boxes put together by the family, usually. You know, access to the burying ground, it was truly a public space. Portland Neck, or the town of Portland, had lots of green space. You can see that there were lots of animals, and I found 2 notices where cows just strayed off the property. in June and July here. And it just shows you that, this was sort of like a farming community in many ways, even though there was lots of activity on the waterfront. And the burying ground was meant to be for public use. So people had access to it, and they would just bring the bodies, their family members would bring the bodies up and place them in a grave. They would do the digging typically on their own. And with a death every 3 days on average, there was always some activity at the cemetery from spring thaw until winter freeze. There was always somebody being buried or a new grave being dug or somebody looking for a grave to be dug because, it was on average, as you can see, every few days. A year after statehood, the town decided to fence the space. So if there were stray animals roaming around, they would have been kept out as of 1821 and beyond. Families really were managing their own burials from the inception of the space in 1668 until around 1834. That's when the town really sort of took more control over making the rules and overseeing burials and an orderly system for them to bury the town's dead. There were no undertakers, no funeral parlors. The parish sextons were loosely organized to help families with their burial arrangements. There were some men who we know were paid to dig graves, but by and large, the females in the household would wash and prepare the body. The men would build the coffin and dig the grave. There were no coffin maker ads in any of the newspapers in 1820, and the only ads at all related to the business of death were for stonecutters. That was really it. The cemetery itself in 1820 was well used. As you can see, I plotted all of the known graves in 1820. The red dots are confirmed graves with the plot or stone, with the plot known or stone in place. The green are presumed cenotaphs for people who were lost at sea. But every section of the cemetery, as you can see, was used in 1820. So for winter, of course, the ground is frozen. This is a familiar sight for those of you who know Eastern Cemetery well. This is actually Funeral Lane coming off from Congress Street. But as you walk by Congress Street, you'll see this wooden structure. This we call the dead house. It's not the original one that would have been on the property, but in 1820, there certainly would have been some kind of a wooden structure for the storage of bodies over winter until spring thaw. So this didn't go up until the 1870s. Here's the entrance to the city tomb, which was middle of the century as well. So whatever was on site in 1820 is long gone, but there would have been something for people to store bodies until spring thaw. That was the case throughout our region. Most towns with a utilitarian burying ground would have had some space set aside for the storage of bodies. In the more rural areas, people stored bodies in their own barns. I mean, they just couldn't dig a grave and they had to place the bodies somewhere. And there was an interest in maximizing space. So what they typically did was lined everybody up in these straight lines as best they could, as you can see by this winter and summertime scene. The town meeting in 1820, in March of that year, actually just happened, only 1820, addressed the overcrowding at Eastern Cemetery at the burying ground and the need for more burial space. So there was already worries that the place was just too full in 1820. As you're standing at Eastern Cemetery, when you come visit, you'll notice, as you see in this picture, you're looking here at the back of all the stones. Everyone was buried in an east-west orientation so that their head, here's a footstone and a headstone, their head is to the west, their feet are to the east. The concept there is from the Puritan days. The belief is you would rise to greet the dawn. So the resurrection is that you're rising from your bed of death. And so the bodies are all resting east-west so that when they sit up, they're facing the sunrise, facing the east. And therefore, everybody's grave inscriptions are on the outside of the stone on the western edge, and then the footstone on the other side. So anyway, that's why you see on one direction, all blank reverses of the stones. When you turn around and look the other way, you're seeing all the inscriptions facing you. So for African Americans, this is actually a Boston burial, but I found this in the Portland newspaper. and I found it to be interesting, as people of color are generally interred in the evening by those of their own complexion, the coffin was suffered to remain till night. So again, this was a Boston occurrence, but this was in the Portland newspaper. I asked a friend of mine, a colleague, to help me understand what this was about. And she said that it was a custom that was likely carried on from the earlier days of slavehood. Of course, there were no enslaved people in 1820 in Portland, but she said this was Dr. June Hobbs. Enslaved people usually buried their dead at night. It was a way to have some space for their own rituals away from the prying eyes of white folks. Burying at night also meant not getting into trouble for shirking work. So this was a custom or tradition that had occurred during enslavement, and most likely just lasted for many years afterwards. And that's why they were burying at night. So no suicides were reported in Portland in 1820. There were no hangings either. The last one had occurred in Portland in 1808. But people who died by suicide or were criminals and therefore hanged were placed in unmarked graves, and they were always on the outer edges of the burying ground. They weren't have been in the prime section. This is an article again from a Boston matter, a hanging that occurred in Boston in 1820. But I wanted to show you a couple of things here. The red line, typically you'll see the words, how people passed into eternity. But when you have a hanging, they would always say the person was launched into eternity. So the platform was cut. It says at the moment the rope which sustained the platform was cut and the prisoner was launched into eternity. So it's just something you find when you see those words. It's typically because the person was executed, put to death. And down at the bottom is the other interesting thing. So this was a prisoner, a criminal who had been sentenced to death. The surgeon having pronounced him to be dead, he was taken down and buried in the adjacent burying ground, it not being a part of the sentence that his body should be given for dissection. So I don't know whether there was any medical dissections occurring in Portland in 1820. Certainly in Boston there was. And so it shows you that sometimes bodies were, especially for criminals, used for the purpose of furthering medical science. So people are now had their funeral, their families got them ready to go. They've now been placed in their grave. And what do? Well, for the many, ordinary people, ordinary citizens in Portland who couldn't afford a gravestone, they would create their own homemade marker out of wood, or they would place a piece of found stone on the grave to mark it. The problem, of course, with wood is it doesn't last many years at all. It'll just rot away. The problem with found stone is when they're not marked, then we lose who's actually in those graves over time. The families move on and we don't know who those people are. But there would have been many wooden and found stone markers at Eastern Cemetery. Most people were put in individual plots. Those would have been dug by the family or friends, or even hired out to someone who would dig a grave for $1 or $2. Graves in the colonial times and maybe just beyond were not 6 feet deep like they are required to be today. They were 3 to 6 feet deep. It really depended on what was below ground. People would dig until they hit a ledge and couldn't dig any farther, and that was the depth of the grave. So the whole notion of 6 feet under is a more modern term than it used to be. There were some families that would have staked out their ground, such as this fenced lot. This is at Eastern Cemetery as well, beyond 1820, but some families would plot out, save space for their family, such as this. And then one of the things that really sets Eastern Cemetery apart from many other colonial cemeteries in New England is the fact that the townspeople who were managing this space decided to create a whole series of underground family tombs. These were for the well-to-do citizens that could purchase one of these tombs with a private stairway entrance into it, and they could fit up to 30 bodies in those tombs. What you're looking at here is one row of tombs. There's a second one right here. There's 4 parallel rows, 86 of them in all. Now those began shortly after 1795, and it took over 30 years for them to complete all of these tombs. So there was certainly construction on them underway in 1820. This would have been a very busy area because there would have been construction of some tombs and burials occurring in other ones that were already done. what you see here is families decorating them how they chose. There's some obelisks here and other monuments. These up close here is a box tomb. And just so that you know, a box tomb is simply a type of monument. There's no body in this box. These are all just above ground monuments. All bodies are below ground in our part of the world. Down south, of course, that's not the same thing. So back to the map for a second. Here's the 4 rows of tombs. Each one has got 20 or so in it, as you can see. As you walk in from Congress Street down Funeral Lane, the flagpole at the bend of the road is here. And as you take that corner, you'll see that whole first row. And then it's easy to find those parallel rows of tombs. It's really quite a unique space, so worth checking out if you haven't been in there. One of the other things true in 1820, many people who purchased a stone would have gotten 2 stones, a headstone, which is this, facing away from us, and a footstone here. Footstones were typically made of the same material and had the same general shape, but would only have the person's initials, maybe a date. What this did with the inscriptions on the outside of these headstones here, since the grave is here, the head and the foot, it allowed people to walk up and down the rows without stepping on the grave so they could see who was buried in that space. And some people think that you don't step on a grave out of respect to the dead. The more likely reason to not step on the grave in 1820 is because some of these are shallow graves. There's no concrete vault like we have today. Simply underground was a wooden box and a body, both of which deteriorate and sink. So you don't want to step on that and potentially fall through. So we go to memorialization now. In print, sometimes the newspaper didn't just do a one-liner, they would actually memorialize the person, such as this case, Cornelius Barnes, age 17. While living, he was a youth and an admirable disposition, sound mind and exemplary conduct. In health and prosperity, he was cheerful without levity. In sickness and adversity, he was placid and patient, even without a murmur. In eternity, we have reason to believe he is enjoying the rewards of the righteous. Typically, people just got a one-line notice, so that was special to find that in July of 1820. So memorialization on stone was through symbolism and words. Symbolism, this is the finality of death, so the skull and crossbone from the early days, this is pre-1820, the finality of death, that evolved into the winged face or the soul effigy, which is illustrated by the separation of the soul from the mortal remains. So we have the body, mortal remains buried, the human part, the soul rising to heaven, and the wings are assisting in that rise to heaven. In 1820, the primary symbolism was the urn and willow, the urn signifying death, the willow mourning, so we have death and mourning together. This is actually stone from 1820, as you can see. And then words. Gravestones almost always have an inscription, which is the name, the date, the age. They sometimes have an epitaph, which is a verse. And typically the epitaph is at the bottom with the inscription size 1/3 to 1/2 of the inscription size up above here. So typically often a rhyming verse or religious verse in a smaller sort of font. Here's a couple I pulled off stones from 1820. This first one is for Rowena Ilsley, who was 13, and 5 of her siblings who had died in their childhood. The epitaph reads, "Their Savior's smiles dispelled their gloom and smoothed their passage to the tomb." This one for Nancy Dennison, age 13. "Short was my time and strong was my pain. To rest in Christ is now my gain. Dry up your tears and weep no more. I am not lost, but gone before." So we're going to meet some monument makers now. Who made the monuments that we actually find in 1820? So they were using slate and marble. Those are the primary materials. Slate is the gray, marble is the white. Bartlett Adams, as many of you know, I'm his biographer. He was 1776 to 1828. He established the first successful stone cutting shop in Portland in 1800. He trained and employed at least a dozen other cutters and really changed the landscape of Southern Maine with about 2,000 markers that have been able to catalog in 300 cemeteries in our area. Here's one of his more beautiful urns beautifully done, just really great attention to detail, not a mistake on the piece. Here are some other examples of his work. Here's it's actually a winged face. The wings are off to the side there. A rosette on a branch, and then a personified sunrise. He was in Boston from 1818 to 1820, he opened a shop with his brother Richard. But he came back towards the end of 1820. While he was away, for those 2 years, he left his shop in the hands of a bad boy nephew, Elias Washburn. I call Elias a bad boy for a few reasons. One of them is he arrived in Portland with his new wife, who he'd been married to for just a couple of months. She was only 16. He had impregnated her when she was 15. They had a very quick marriage, and she delivered their first baby just 4 or 5 months after their marriage. By then, they had fled Massachusetts and they were in Portland, and he was in control of Bartlett's shop. He was a bad boy too because he was kind of a sloppy cutter. This is his signature urn. Most carvers had a signature design that you see over and over again. This is his. It was a shield-shaped urn with this, kind of a chain swag to it. Here's a couple examples, but let me show you another one. Here's one on the left. What you'll notice about his signature urn, look at the fluting that goes up from the bottom of the urn, how uneven it is. There's 4 sort of flutes, and they're all a different shape and size. This is his uncle Bartlett Adams. Look how beautifully done that is. The lines on the base here, they're kind of uneven and falling into each other, yet his uncle was able to carve these beautiful swirling lines without any issues at all. So he just wasn't an accomplished stone carver like his uncle was, made kind of a mess of some markers. His urns, I've found 100 of them in 30 cemeteries in Maine, and they're primarily from when you would expect. He was in control of the shop, 1818 to 1820. That's the date that we find on his markers. 1821, he actually had a shop up in Eastport, and there are stones found up there in Eastport cemeteries and across in New Brunswick that I've found, which is why he's got some in 1821. He died very young. He was only 30 when he died. He was in Massachusetts then. So Bartlett came home in 1820. He and his brother had dissolved their partnership down in Boston. Richard Adams stayed there for a little while and kept the business going, but eventually he came to Maine as well. But Bartlett came home with a bunch of new designs. He had sort of reinvented himself, this sort of interesting firework type feature. We'll see that again in a few minutes on his urn with his clasped hands. That's a really classic one. He brought with him Abel Davis, who was a Massachusetts carver born 1798. Abel Davis did beautiful work. He has a really unique number 2, very distinctive. As you can see, it's got this wide loop at the top, and this number 3, as you can see here, similarly. When I see a stone from this period with this number 2 or 3, I know it's him, but then I can also look at the design and tell. He brought some really ornate designs, including this potted willow. You can see it's sort of in a pot here, but look at this urn. It's really well done and beautifully done, and just quite different from the standard Adams shop urns. Here's another one, urn in a Palladian window with the potted willows at either side. All kinds of background design here, columns with urns on them. This would have taken him a couple of weeks anyway, if not longer, to do this. There's so much detail on this. And he brought a new urn shape to the shop. Bartlett Adams, when he opened his shop in 1800, he and the carvers that worked with him all usually followed this shield-shaped urn with different designs on them, but this was the basic shape. Abel Davis brought what I call a cinched waist urn. It's this carved out center here. And he introduced this look to the Portland shop, and later on, all the carvers adopted that as their urn as well. This is a stone that could have been cut anytime from 1825 to 1840 by Bartlett Adams, his successors when he died in 1828. There's hundreds of this design out there. It's sort of got that cinched waist. It's not the shield shape anymore, but that's the design that sort of persevered from the shop in the mid 1820s and beyond. Excuse me. Abel Davis also brought a monstrance for Portland's Catholics. He did about 5 or 6 of this design. I didn't understand what it was. It took me a long time to sort it out, but this is only on Catholic stones. this design here. And then when I talked to a couple of folks who are expert in the Catholic religion, they said, oh, it looks like a monstrance. So that's what one looks like today. But this was his interpretation of that on markers for a few of Portland's Catholics. Okay, we're getting close to the end, folks. So some of the markers, here's one from 1820, a marble. It's just eroded away. We have no idea what the design was on that. It's just the nature of marble, which is very soft and typically erodes quickly. And then this one is a slate. This is also an 1820s death, but notice the family chose not to have any decorations, just a plain slate. The cost of markers in 1820, we're lucky to have one that was, this one here, September 22, 1820 for George Gray. While undergoing conservation by our conservation crew at Spirits Alive, they dug this one up to do some work on it and discovered right here on the stone the price of $5.75. So thanks to Janet Alexander for sending me those photos so I could include them tonight. And compare $5.75 to other costs I found in the newspaper. There was a 1 cent reward for the return of a runaway apprentice. Pound of cheese costs 10 cents, pound of coffee 25, gallon of molasses 30 cents, a pair of ladies' high lace shoes $1.33, a gallon of Portuguese wine $1.40, writing paper $2.25. So for $5.75, you could buy a nice gravestone, or you could get 3 or 4 gallons of Portuguese wine. The predominant design was the urn and the willow, and it took many different forms. This is the stone after conservation that we just looked at for George Gray that had the price tag on it. Here's an interesting one, different sort of shape, nice design here. This one, thank you to Diane for these photographs. It's an urn and willow. This is sort of an elongated urn as opposed to the sort of short, squat. This one is a Bartlett Adams marker. He kept the shield shape, but he put this gentle little sort of ivy or twig on his marker. And what better way to end this all with some fireworks? This is a Bartlett design, this firework he put on this urn, which was something he brought back from his time in Massachusetts. He did a few of these, prior to his death in 1828. We see them in that date range of the 25 to 28 range. So that's basically it. So if you're interested in learning more, there's a companion paper to this talk, which is available at Maine Historical Society in their collections. Also, you can go to Spirits Alive website, spiritsalive.org, and download that to read it. If you're interested in reading more about Bartlett Adams, that's the early gravestone book, Eastern Cemetery book. I'm the author of those 3, but you can get them all at Maine Historical. They're already there available for you in the gift shop. So let's open it up.
Thank you, Ron. That was excellent. And we're getting some questions in the chat and in the
Great.
Q&A. One question, do you know what the population of Portland was in 1820?
Yeah, it was 8,500 was the census. They recorded 8,500 people. Yep.
8,500. Okay. Elizabeth asks, were smallpox victims separated from others in cemeteries?
I'm sorry, who separated?
Were people that died of smallpox when they were buried in cemeteries, were they separated from
Yeah,
others?
I mean, we didn't have a big smallpox outbreak that presented any problems. And I've seen in some cemeteries that people with smallpox were just buried with everybody else in their family lot. However, when there was a big outbreak of an illness like smallpox that took a bunch of people down at the same time, it is true that many cemeteries would have put them all in a mass grave or separated them out and put them in a line, all in their own section, just because you had so many people dying at the same time. That's what's going on today with the COVID. We typically see people who are dying being put in a different cemetery with their family, but as we all have seen in the past year, there were some communities that were creating mass graves and putting everybody, regardless of anything else, in those graves together, out of necessity, really.
Holly asks, where did you get that number of deaths for 1820? How did you determine that total?
The deaths per 1,000? Yeah, It's just a calculation of how many people were in town, how many deaths are occurring. And it's, I forget what the number was, I have to go back and look at the slide, but I think it was 16 per thousand for Portland. Yeah, so it's just a simple calculation. And that is many of the communities that were reported it that same way. They would just take the number of people and the number of deaths, number of people in town, and the number of deaths that occurred that same time period. Yep.
Neil asks an interesting question. Were there any murders in Portland that year?
There were no reported murders that year. In Portland, however, just outside, I kind of wanted this to be Portland because it would have been interesting, not to make, light of a murder. But there was a body of a man found just outside Portland Harbor in Cape Elizabeth in 1820, near Portland Headlight. So they called it in the paper, the entrance to Portland Harbor. His throat had been slit from ear to ear. His hands and his feet were missing, and they found the body in the water. The coroner of Cape Elizabeth did the, review of the body, and I'm sure that that body probably ended up at Mount Pleasant or one of the cemeteries in Cape Elizabeth, not Portland. So the closest I could get was that one issue but it was just outside of Portland.
Amy asks, did people have to purchase burial spaces in Eastern Cemetery?
They did not. In 1820, there was no charge for burial spaces. It was, again, still truly a public space. In the early days when it was established, it was a common, like a common field for grazing, a common area for market, a common area for playing games, common area for burials. So people had access to that burial space, which is why people would just show up and start digging and find somebody already there. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And it wasn't until over 150 years after its inception that the town really kind of, took better control of the space and figured out how to do it. By then it was full and they were operating out of Western Cemetery, then later Forest City and Evergreen and others that came. Yep.
Dave asks, what was the significance of an urn on a headstone?
Yeah, the urn comes from Greek imagery and iconography, and it was I don't know who started it, but it was the kind of an image that was being shown on tapestries and paintings and gravestones and other media all at the same time. It arose around 1800. It became the most popular symbol on grave markers, and it was the urn representing death and the willow mourning, and that pairing stayed together for much of the 1800s.
Amy says, there's a very small section for Catholics in Eastern Cemetery. Were people being buried in Calvary Cemetery in South Portland at that time? Or is it just that there aren't as many Catholics in the population?
Yes, there were very, very few Catholics in Portland until the mid-century, well after Eastern Cemetery was full. There was a tiny patch set over by the African Americans in the oldest section. When the new section came about as of 1795, the front section, there was a Catholic patch set aside there, but it was not consecrated ground. So anybody buried there was buried there because they were a minority Catholic and just put in a grave. A priest visited and would bless the grave, but it was not consecrated ground. When Western Cemetery was developed in the 1830s, they actually put a large section of consecrated Catholic ground there. At that point, that's where the Catholics were going. And many from Eastern Cemetery were dug up and removed to Western. Calvary comes about 20 years later. So Calvary is much newer. And by then the population had exploded. But by the time Calvary in South Portland opened, there were people from Eastern and Western that were all being dug up and removed to Calvary as well. So there were removals, sometimes twice over time. But Calvary was not open in 1820 is the answer. Yep.
Joy asks, are there any pictures of the original dead house? I assume she means the one from Eastern Cemetery.
Yeah, no, there is not. Nope.
Faye
if there is, let me know. If you find one, somebody let me know. Love
Sure.
to see it.
Faye asks, can the underground tombs, can they currently be accessed?
We don't the stairways that go down into those tombs have all been filled in with sand. And so nobody goes in them anymore. There hasn't been any burials in them for, decades and decades and decades. Once in a while, there'll be a failure where things settle and the sand goes in and the city has to come in and refill it and recap it for us. But no, we don't go down into those tombs. There are actually bodies and, remains in there. So out of respect for the family, we wouldn't go in there anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again, Ron, for being here and for sharing this fascinating talk and all of your research with us. Folks, if you're interested in any of Ron's books, you can find them through Maine Historical Society. Visit mainhistorystore.com. If you're interested in seeing the recorded version of this program or other virtual programs, or learning more about our upcoming programs, how you can visit Maine Historical Society, become a member, visit our website at mainhistory.org. Ron, was there anything else that you wanted to say or share with us before we go?
I'm just going to say thank you to everybody. Thank you, Kathleen, for hosting as well. I very quickly went through the last slide with my email on it. If anybody would like to be in touch with me with questions that you come to mind after we end, my email address is ROROMAN, so it's Roman at Maine, the state, MAINE.RR.com. So ROROMAN at maine.rr.com. Feel free to be in touch. And if you, for some reason, can't get through to me, I'm sure Kathleen will be happy to forward a message if you send it to her.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I'd be happy to answer questions even after we're done.
Thank you. Thanks again, everyone, for being with us. And I hope we'll see you all back here soon.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.